OSHA revised its hazard communication standard to align with United Nations globally harmonized system of classification and labeling of chemicals. The purpose is the implementation of a communication system which will inform both employers and employees of the hazards of any chemicals used in the workplace. To help companies comply with the revised standard, OSHA is phasing in the specific requirements over several years, from December 1st, 2013 to June 1st, 2016. Two significant changes are the required use of new labeling elements and a new standardized format for safety data sheets. Training is needed early in the transition process since workers are already seeing new labels and the new SDSs in the workplace. BWI has established a training and information program for employees exposed to hazardous chemicals. Training will be provided at the inception of the new program, at the time of initial hiring, during any reassignment, and whenever a new hazard is introduced into the work area. This training will consist of the requirements of the Right to Know laws and the specific of BWI's Hazardous Communication Plan. This plan is kept in the printed or online safety compliance manual and includes training for the safe work practices, emergency procedures, and use of personal protective equipment. As of June 1st, 2015, all labels will be required to have the following. The product identifier. This is how the hazardous chemical is identified. It can be the chemical name, code number, or batch number. The supplier identification. This is the name, address, and phone number of the chemical manufacturer, distributor, or importer. The precautionary statements. These are phrases that describe recommended measures that should be taken to minimize or prevent adverse effects resulting from exposure to a hazardous chemical or improper storage or handling of that hazardous chemical. Here you'll also find in case of fire instructions and first aid directions. Here you'll find the hazard statements. These describe the nature of the hazards of the chemical, including the degree of hazard. All applicable hazard statements must appear on the label. Now, hazard statements can be combined, where appropriate, to reduce redundancies and improve readability. Hazard statements are specific to the hazard classification categories, and chemical users should always see the same statement for the same hazards, no matter what the chemical is or who produces it. The signal word. This is used to indicate the relative level of severity of hazard and to alert the reader to a potential hazard on the label. There are only two signal words, danger and warning. Danger is used for the more severe hazards, and warning is used for the less severe hazards. There will only be one signal word on the label, no matter how many hazards a chemical may have. Pictograms. Pictograms must appear as shown in this training. More than one pictogram may appear on a label or SDS. Currently, there are 9 OSHA pictograms. Supplemental information can include directions for use, weight, lot number, and expiration date. Let's take a closer look at Hazard Communication Standard pictograms and the hazards which they represent. For instructional purposes, the pictograms most easily break down into 3 groups. The first group are those which represent physical hazards. In our training, corrosion is listed first. And that is because corrosion is a physical hazard and a health hazard. So for instructional purposes only, you will see it listed twice in this training. The corrosion pictogram displays vials spilling a substance on an object and a hand, simulating burns. The hazards include skin corrosion and burns, eye damage, and corrosive to metal. The flame pictogram looks just like you'd expect. Its hazards include flammables, pyrophorics, self-heating, emits flammable gas, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. The gas cylinder pictogram represents gas under pressure hazards. The flame over circle pictogram represents oxidizers and their hazards. The exploding bomb pictogram represents hazards such as explosives, self-reactives, and organic peroxides. Next, let's look at the pictograms grouped as health hazards. Corrosives, which we've already covered. The health hazard pictogram has a head and shoulders silhouette with a toxic blob in the middle of it. The hazards include carcinogen, mutagenicity, reproductive toxicity, respiratory sensitizer, target organ toxicity, and aspiration toxicity. A good rule of thumb when handling hazardous chemicals with the health hazard label, which describe items that you may not be able to pronounce or you may not know the definition of, be very careful. The exclamation mark pictogram represents hazards such as a skin and eye irritant, a skin sensitizer, acute toxicity, narcotic effects, respiratory tract irritant, and hazardous to the ozone layer. As you might expect, the skull and crossbones pictogram represents the hazard acute toxicity. For instructional purposes, the final group of pictograms are the environmental hazards. The environment pictogram is currently non-mandatory by OSHA's GHS program. However, it does represent aquatic toxicity. Please review the More Label Facts portion of your training, but here are 2 facts you'll want to remember. Labels on containers should never be removed or defaced. And the only time a label is not required is when an employee uses a portable container for immediate use, as long as no other employee is involved and the chemical in the container is completely used. Before we leave the label section of the training and move on to the SDS portion, let's take a closer look at what labels and SDSs are and what they have in common. Labels provide essential information in a brief format. You'll find them affixed to chemical containers and packaging. SDSs provide more detailed and technical information. They're kept in a designated location where all employees have immediate access to them. Information you'll find on both includes the precautionary information, including in case of fire and first aid, the signal word, the hazard communications and statements, the pictograms, and the product identifier. Before we get started, here are a few facts about safety data sheets. Safety data sheets do not have to be printed in color. An SDS is not required if a product is used in the workplace similar to how it would be used in a home, and kept in similar quantities. Examples might be window cleaner or floor cleaner. BWI employees and customers may request an SDS for any hazardous chemical in the inventory, and it will be provided within a reasonable amount of time. Now they're called SDSs. They used to be called MSDSs. It really doesn't matter what you call them, as long as you know how to ask for them, where to find them, and how to use them. The SDS is prepared by the chemical manufacturer supplier. It's provided to users of the product to communicate the potential hazards associated with the product. As of June 1st, 2015, the HCS will require new SDSs to be in a uniform format and include the section numbers, headings, and associated information that we're about to review. Section 1, Identification. This is the product identifier used on the label, or any common names or synonyms. The contact information for the supplier is also found here, and recommended uses and restrictions on use. Section 2, Hazards Identification. These are all hazards regarding the chemical and the required label elements, such as hazard classification, signal word, hazard statements, pictograms, precautionary statements, descriptions of any hazards not otherwise classified, and for mixtures containing ingredients of unknown toxicity, a statement of how much of the mixture consists of this ingredient. Section 3, Composition and Information on Ingredients. You'll find the ingredients contained in the product, the chemical name, common name, and synonyms. For mixtures, you'll find the chemical name and concentration of ingredients. For chemicals where trade secrets are claimed, there'll be a statement of trade secret claim and the type of information being withheld. Now remember, in cases of a trade secret, this information must be divulged in cases of an emergency. Section 4, First Aid Measures. First aid instructions, description of the most important symptoms of exposure, and recommendations for immediate medical care and special treatment if necessary. Section 5, Firefighting Measures. You'll find recommendations for extinguishing equipment, advice on specific hazards a chemical poses during a fire. You'll find recommendations on protective equipment or precautions for firefighters. And you'll also find the NFPA hazard codes, which can be posted on buildings to alert firefighting personnel of the hazards inside. Section 6, Accidental Release Measures. Here you'll find recommendations for appropriate response to spills, leaks, or releases, including the use of personal precautions and personal protective equipment. You'll find practices for containment and cleanup, as well as emergency procedures. Section 7, Handling and Storage. Here you'll find precautions for safe handling, including recommendations for handling incompatible chemicals, minimizing release, and general hygiene practices. You'll also find recommendations on safe storage conditions, including incompatibilities. Section 8, Exposure Controls and Personal Protection. Here you'll find OSHA's permissible exposure limits, the PELs. That's the amount of the chemical a person can be safely exposed to without the need of personal protective equipment. You'll also find the threshold limit values. That's the level a worker can be exposed to daily without adverse health effects. You'll also find appropriate engineering controls and personal protective equipment that should be used. Section 9, Physical and Chemical Properties. This lists the chemical's characteristics. Examples: soluble, will the chemical dissolve in water? Or vapor density, the weight of a gas or vapor compared to an equal volume of air. For example, if air equals 1, chemicals with a vapor density higher than air will sink. Section 10. Stability and reactivity. This lists the chemical stability and possibility of hazardous reactions. Section 11. Toxicological information. This includes information on likely exposure routes, the description of delayed or immediate or chronic effects of exposure. It also includes the numerical measures of toxicity. Example, LD50 means a lethal ingested dose is expected to kill 50% of the exposed subjects. Also includes a description of symptoms of exposure and an indication of whether the chemical is a carcinogen. All right, here we are in the home stretch. But before we go on, since other agencies regulate the information in sections 12, 13, 14, and 15, OSHA will not enforce those items, but it is important that you know what's contained. So now let's finish this training so we can move on to other things. Section 12, Ecological Information. This includes information to evaluate the environmental impact of the chemicals if released into the environment. Section 13, Disposal Considerations. This includes guidance on proper disposal practices, recycling, or reclamation of the chemicals or its container, and safe handling practices. Section 14, Transport Information. This includes classification information for shipping and transporting of hazardous chemicals by road, air, rail, or sea. Section 15, Regulatory Information. This includes relevant safety, health, and environmental regulations not indicated anywhere else on the SDS, including any OSHA, Department of Transportation, Environmental Protection Agency, or Consumer Product Safety Commission regulations. And the final section on the SDS sheet, Section 16, Other Information. This includes the date of preparation or last revision of the SDS. If you need a safety data sheet for any hazardous chemical kept in inventory at any BWI location, they're available on any warehouse operations computer that has internet access by clicking on the SDS icon on the desktop screen. Ask a member of management to show you how to do this, and then try it once by yourself. A listing of hazardous chemicals kept in inventory at any BWI location and the storage locations of those chemicals can be provided using the Warehouse Management System. Please see the Location Warehouse Manager for more information. Safety data sheets will always be provided to customers and employees upon request. And please remember, prior to non-BWI personnel performing any work assignments in the warehouse area, the contractor is required to meet with the warehouse manager to review any precautionary measures, labeling system use, SDS access, and the locations of any hazardous materials present. All right, you survived the training. Now all that's left is to take a short quiz and fill out the attendance roster, and then start becoming familiar with the locations, characteristics, and hazards of the chemicals in your work area, because maintaining a safe workplace is everyone's responsibility.